The air on 125th Street wasn't just hot, it was angry. It was the kind of August heat that settled into the pavement and radiated back up through the soles of your shoes, cooking the blood in your veins before you even took a step. It was 3 in the morning, but the city wasn't sleeping. It was holding its breath. Inside the small apartment on the 3rd floor, the curtains were drawn tight. A single fan blade sliced through the stagnant smoke of a cigarette that had burned down to the filter. The man sitting in the leather chair hadn't moved in an hour. He wasn't asleep. He was listening. He was listening to the tires on the wet asphalt below. He was listening for the heavy, confident footsteps of men who didn't belong on this block. He was listening for the click of a bolt sliding home. Most men, when they know they are being hunted, they run. They pack a bag, they grab the cash from under the floorboards, and they disappear into the night, hoping to become a ghost in Chicago or a nobody in Canada. But the man in the chair didn't run. He knew that running was a confession. Running told the wolves that you were prey, and he was not prey. He checked the pistol on the table next to him, a Colt .45, heavy, reliable. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it, measuring the distance between his hand and the grip, calculating the time it would take to raise it, to aim, to fire. Fractions of a second. In his world, a fraction of a second was the difference between a legend and a corpse. Outside, a car door slammed. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The man's eyes shifted to the window, but his head didn't turn. He waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Silence returned. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that rattled slightly in his chest. It wasn't them, not yet, but they were coming. He could feel it. The order had been given 3 miles south, in a room full of smoke and expensive suits. A name had been spoken, a price had been set, and now the clock was ticking down on the most dangerous week the city had ever seen. The streets were about to bleed, and he was the vein they were trying to cut. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you about the end of the war. They will give you the dates of the funerals and the headlines of the newspapers. They will tell you that the Dutch threats were neutralized and that order was restored. But they never tell you about the week that preceded the silence. They don't tell you about the 7 days where the laws of gravity seemed to suspend, where the entire underworld of New York City teetered on the edge of a razor blade. The files on this week were not kept in police precincts. They were burned. Because what happened during those 168 hours wasn't just a gang war. It was a masterclass in survival. It was the moment where the old world of brute force collided with the new world of strategic intellect, and only one man saw the collision coming. What you are about to hear is the story of how a single man, cornered and outgunned, turned a death sentence into a coronation. This story will change how you understand fear. It will show you that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one in your hand, but the one in your mind. But before the strategy, you have to understand the exhaustion. Bumpy Johnson was human. We forget that. We see the photos, the suits, the stoic expression, and we imagine a machine. But in that sweltering August, he was a man who hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night for a month. The pressure wasn't just the threat of violence, it was the weight of expectation. Every shopkeeper who paid him for protection, every mother who waved to him on the street, every kid who wanted to run numbers, they were all looking at him. They sensed the shift in the air. They saw the strange cars circling the block. They saw the fear in the eyes of his lieutenants. If he fell, Harlem fell. If he ran, the wolves would tear the neighborhood apart looking for scraps. He was the dam holding back a flood of chaotic violence, and he could feel the cracks forming in his own resolve. He sat in that chair, rubbing his eyes, feeling the grit of the city under his eyelids. He thought about his family. He thought about the quiet life he sometimes pretended he could have had, a life of books and chess games played in parks without looking over his shoulder. It was a fantasy, a cruel one that visited him only when he was weakest. He knew his own men were scared. He could smell it on them. The way they fumbled with their lighters, the way they talked a little too loud, laughed a little too hard. They were waiting for him to tell them it was going to be okay. But he couldn't lie to them, not this time. Because this time, the enemy wasn't just a rival, it was Dutch Schultz. And the Dutchman wasn't just a gangster, he was a force of nature unraveling. Schultz had lost his mind. That was the whisper on the street, and for once the whisper was true. The Dutchman was hemorrhaging money. The grand jury was closing in. Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor, was tightening the noose, dismantling Schultz's empire brick by brick. A rational man looks for a deal. A rational man hires better lawyers. But Schultz wasn't rational. He was a rabid animal trapped in a corner, snapping at anything that moved. He had decided that the only way to survive was to kill everyone. He wanted to kill the prosecutor, he wanted to kill the witnesses, and most importantly, he wanted to kill the man who refused to bow down in Harlem. He wanted Bumpy Johnson. The bounty was massive. It was enough to make a loyal man question his loyalty. It was enough to make a brother turn on a brother. $50,000. In the middle of the Great Depression, that wasn't money, that was a kingdom. The week began on a Monday, with a message delivered not in an envelope, but through a brick thrown through the window of a numbers bank on 135th Street. There was no note attached, just the brick. It was a statement. We are here. Nowhere is safe. Bumpy stood in the glass shards, looking at the brick. His men were shouting, racking shotguns, ready to go to war. They wanted to ride out. They wanted to burn down a brewery in the Bronx. They wanted blood for glass. Bumpy raised a hand, just one hand, and the room went quiet. "Clean it up," he said softly. "But Bumpy," one of his captains started, "we gotta hit back. We gotta show them." Bumpy turned to him. His eyes were devoid of anger. They were cold, calculating pools. You hit back when you know where to hit. Right now, they want you to run into the street so they can pick you off from the rooftops. They want noise. We give them silence. He walked out of the numbers bank and into the daylight. This was the first move of the chess game. He walked openly. He didn't hide. He walked down the avenue, nodding to the street vendors, tipping his hat to the ladies. It was a terrifying display of confidence. To walk without fear when there was a price on your head is the ultimate act of defiance. It unsettled the spotters watching from the alleyways. They had their hands on their guns, but they didn't draw. Why? Because he looked too calm. What does he know? They wondered. Is it a trap? That was the seed Bumpy planted. Doubt. By Wednesday, the tension had escalated. Schultz was growing impatient. He was screaming at his own men, beating them for their hesitation. "He's one man," Schultz roared in a back room in Newark. "One man in a cheap suit. Why is he still breathing?" Schultz didn't understand that Bumpy wasn't just a man, he was an ecosystem. Every taxi driver in Harlem was Bumpy's eyes. Every waiter, every doorman, every shoeshine boy. When a car with Jersey plates crossed 110th Street, Bumpy knew about it before it hit 116th. He moved through the city like a phantom. He slept in a different bed every few hours. He held meetings in the back of movie theaters, in the basements of churches, in the kitchens of soup kitchens. He was tired, yes, but his mind was sharpening. He realized that he couldn't win a shooting war. Schultz had too many guns. If it came down to bullets, Bumpy would lose. He had to change the battlefield. He had to make Schultz's death the only logical solution for the people who actually controlled the board. Thursday was the turning point. This was the day the fear almost broke him. He was sitting in a diner, drinking black coffee. The place was empty. The waitress, an old woman who had known him since he was a boy, was wiping down the counter. A car pulled up slowly outside. Black sedan, tinted windows. Bumpy froze. His hand drifted to his lap, gripping the napkin holder. He watched the car. It idled there. The engine purred, a low, menacing growl. "This is it," he thought. He didn't think about his empire. He didn't think about the money. He thought about the waitress. "She doesn't deserve to see this," he thought. "She doesn't deserve to clean up the blood." He stood up slowly, intending to walk to the door, to draw the fire outside. But the car didn't open. The window rolled down an inch. A hand appeared, flicked a cigarette butt onto the sidewalk, and the car drove away. Bumpy sat back down. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then how close the edge was. He realized that luck was a finite resource, and his was running out. He needed to end this. Now. He couldn't get to Schultz. The Dutchman was surrounded by an army. But Bumpy knew who could get to him. The Commission. The Italians. Luciano. They were watching this war with interest. They didn't care about Bumpy, and they didn't care about Harlem. They cared about business. And Schultz was bad for business. He was bringing heat. He was planning to kill a prosecutor, a move that would bring the full weight of the federal government down on the entire mafia. Luciano knew this. Lansky knew this. But they were hesitant. To kill a boss was against the rules. They needed a push. Bumpy decided to give them a shove. He sent a message, not to Schultz, but to Luciano. He didn't ask for a meeting. He didn't ask for help. He sent a simple ledger, a book of numbers. It wasn't the numbers of the lottery. It was the numbers of the war. He detailed exactly how much money Schultz was losing them. He detailed the police overtime costs. He detailed the lost revenue from the clubs that were closing early due to the fear of violence. He spoke their language, the language of profit. And at the bottom of the ledger he wrote one line: "The dog is rabid. If you don't put him down, the law will put us all down." It was a gamble. If Luciano took offense, Bumpy was dead. If he saw it as weakness, Bumpy was dead. But Bumpy was banking on Luciano's cold reptilian logic. Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of agonizing silence. No response. The streets were empty. The heat wave broke, and rain lashed the city, turning the gutters into black rivers. Bumpy sat in his apartment, listening to the rain. He played chess against himself, white pieces against black, attack against defense. He was losing to himself. That decision would haunt him forever, he thought, looking at the board. The decision to trust the logic of his enemies. Then Sunday came, the 7th day. The phone rang. It wasn't a sleek, modern ring. It was a jarring, mechanical bell that echoed in the empty room. Bumpy stared at it. He let it ring 3 times. 4. He picked it up. "Hello," he said. His voice was steady. "It's done," a voice said. Click. Bumpy stood there, holding the receiver, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it almost knocked him over. He walked to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped. The streetlights were reflecting on the wet pavement. Miles away, in the Palace Chop House in Newark, Dutch Schultz was bleeding out on a bathroom floor. He had been shot by his own kind. The commission had acted, not to save Bumpy Johnson, but to save themselves. But Bumpy knew the truth. He knew that he had guided the bullet. He had created the environment where Schultz's death was inevitable. He had survived the week. The next morning, the headline screamed, "Dutchman dead." Harlem didn't celebrate loudly. There were no parades, but there was a collective exhale. The shopkeepers opened their grates a little earlier. The music in the clubs played a little louder. The shadow had lifted. Bumpy walked down 125th Street that Monday, the same walk he had taken 7 days before, but everything had changed. He wasn't just the boss anymore. He was the survivor. He was the man who had stared into the abyss of the Dutchman's madness and hadn't blinked. People looked at him differently now. There was fear, yes, but there was awe. They whispered that he had magic. They whispered that bullets couldn't touch him. He let them whisper. It was good for business. But deep down, Bumpy knew. It wasn't magic. It wasn't bullets. It was patience. It was the ability to sit in a room while the walls were closing in and think 3 moves ahead. He went to the barber shop. He sat in the chair. He let the towel cover his face. "Shave?" the barber asked, his hands shaking slightly. "Close," Bumpy said. "Real close." As the razor glided over his skin, Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes. He thought about power. Power isn't the ability to make noise. It isn't the ability to destroy. Any fool with a match can burn down a house. True power is the ability to stand in the center of the fire and not get burned. It is the ability to manipulate the forces around you until they do your bidding without them even knowing it. Schultz had power, and he died screaming in a bathroom. Bumpy had control, and he was getting a shave. People looked at him differently now. There was fear, yes, but there was awe. They whispered that he had magic. They whispered that bullets couldn't touch him. He let them whisper. It was good for business. But deep down, Bumpy knew. It wasn't magic. It wasn't bullets. It was patience. It was the ability to sit in a room while the walls were closing in and think 3 moves ahead. He went to the barber shop. He sat in the chair. He let the towel cover his face. "Shave?" the barber asked, his hands shaking slightly. "Close," Bumpy said. "Real close." As the razor glided over his skin, Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes. He thought about power. Power isn't the ability to make noise. It isn't the ability to destroy. Any fool with a match can burn down a house. True power is the ability to stand in the center of the fire and not get burned. It is the ability to manipulate the forces around you until they do your bidding without them even knowing it. Schultz had power, and he died screaming in a bathroom. Bumpy had control, and he was getting a shave. That week in August defined him. It stripped him down to his core and rebuilt him as something harder, something colder, something permanent. He opened his eyes and looked in the mirror. The man staring back was different. He had seen the end, and he had rewritten it. The barber wiped his face. "You look good, Bumpy. You look rested." Bumpy stood up, straightened his tie, and dropped a $10 bill on the counter. "I am," Bumpy said. "I'm just getting started." He walked out into the Harlem sun. The city was his. The silence was his. And as he merged into the crowd, a single thought remained, heavy and final as a tombstone. In the game of kings, pawns are sacrificed, knights are slain, but the player never steps onto the board until the game is already won. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.